It is my distinct pleasure to introduce and welcome Dr. Dmitri Trenin to the first day of the Monterey Summer Symposium on Russia. The term needs no introduction gets thrown around a lot, but I can confidently say that Dr. Trenin needs no introduction. His insight and analysis on Russian foreign policy, US foreign policy, and US-Russia relations have proven to be invaluable to so many around the world. And I can personally say that Dr. Trenin's work has been indispensable in my education. Dr. Trenin's valuable insight, at least likely, comes in part from his very accomplished background. Serving in the Soviet and Russian armies for 21 years, Dr. Trenin rose to the rank of colonel and held many prestigious posts abroad, including in Iraq, Germany, and at the NATO Defense College in Rome. After leaving the army in 1994, Dr. Trenin joined the Carnegie Moscow Center, where he became the first Russian director in 2008. During his 13-plus-year tenure, he oversaw the center's rise to one of the most notable and well-respected in all of the world. In addition to his work at Carnegie, he is a member of the International Institute for Strategic Studies, the Russian International Affairs Council, the Council on Foreign and Defense Policy, and the European Leadership Network, as well as various other organizations. Dr. Trenin is widely published in both English and Russian language journals and has written numerous books about Russia and international relations, the most recent of which being New Balance of Power. Dr. Trenin, thank you very much for being here with us today.
Julian, thank you very much for this overly generous introduction. It's the kind of thing that you want to disappear and not listen to all these nice things said about you, but still, I'm very grateful. Today, I will do the first part of my talk on the drivers of Russia's foreign policy. This is something that more or less, I'm talking about the subject, this is something that I more or less do one way or another in every time I'm invited over to the symposium. But this year it is totally different. It is different because Russia is in a very different place, both domestically and internationally. There's been a rupture of tremendous importance, both in its foreign policy and its domestic developments. And the implications of that are not very clearly seen at this point. So let me suggest that I talk for maybe half hour, maybe slightly more than that. And then I would turn the floor over to you. I hope Julian will help me with directing questions or comments or what have you, reflections. And then we'll spend the rest of our time just talking and addressing the issues that concern you at this point. So let me first discuss where we are, we meaning the Russian Federation and its foreign policy. Then I'll talk about what is on Russia's agenda today. I will spend some time trying to discuss with you the ingredients of the decision taken by President Putin to start his special military operation in in Ukraine. I'll talk about the prospects of that operation or the war that's going on in Ukraine. And then I'll spend, if we have time, maybe this will be for later. So maybe we will stop there and the rest of the drivers will be left over for tomorrow when we discuss, let's say, regional and functional aspects of Russia's foreign policy, talking about relations with the United States, relations with Europe, relations with China, the rest of Asia, India, the Middle East, and other parts of the world, such as India, such as the Middle East, such as Latin America, Africa. And we'll also talk about the functional areas of Russia's foreign policy because they have changed enormously, just like everything else. Arms control, for example, or climate change, or other issues, some of which are almost non-existent today, such as climate change. You don't hear that phrase in Russia anymore since February. So let me go back to where we are today. I've already said, and let me repeat it, I find February 24, 2022, the end of an era for the Russian Federation. Not just for Russia's foreign policy, but for the first iteration of post-Soviet Russia. I wouldn't say that we stepped right into the Russian Federation 2.0. We're in transition, and it's an open-ended transition, and the direction is not yet very clearly set. It is set in some ways, but not exactly in others. So this is something that we will be discussing, I think, in the Q&A. If one talks about Russia's foreign policy, what happened on that day, in the morning of the 24th of February, is the degeneration of the 8-year confrontation between Russia and the West that started in 2014, also in February, as you would recall, with Russia's action in Crimea to counter the move in Kiev, the Maidan Revolution, or as Mr. Putin would call it, an anti-constitutional coup in Kiev. So that period that lasted 8 years, for 8 years, I call it confrontation. This has degenerated into what I would call a hybrid war. I use this expression. It's a very widely spread expression. To me, it's useful because it shows two things. One, that it is some sort of an analogy of the Cold War of the 20th century. At the same time, it shows that it's not a replay of the Cold War. It is a different kind of war. In some ways, it is reminiscent of the Cold War, like it's so far it has been cold, and I hope it stays that way. But in other ways, it is very different, with the common spaces that have been built over the past 30 years in the world, the common economic space, the common information space, common space for humanitarian contacts. These are becoming battlefields. What used to unite us is now a battlefield where very fierce, and I would say decisive battles are being fought, including in one's own country. So that is my first point. We have a hybrid war instead of a confrontation. This hybrid war has very many aspects. One of them is what you would call a proxy war in Ukraine, where Russia and the West are, in fact, fighting over Ukraine, if you like, over principles related to Ukraine, over other things related to Ukraine. But Ukraine is an agent, absolutely. But essentially, this is much more than a Russian-Western conflict, Russian-Ukrainian conflict. This is very much a conflict between Russia and the United West. This is another new feature. Never before, not even in the days of the Cold War, has the West been so firmly united, at least for now, with regards to Russia, as it is today. In the previous periods of confrontation, even when the Soviet Union was in stark opposition to the capitalist West, there were countries on the Western side that were neutral, or were friendly or were cooperating. You could always go around your main adversary, your main enemy, if you like. Not anymore. This is over. This is new. Russia versus the United West. So while 2014 was the end of a one in a century, maybe one in many centuries, attempt by Russia to integrate into the Western system, 2022 signifies a complete rupture of relations with the Western world. And this is very serious because we never experienced that, we in Russia. Not since the days of Peter the Great, when Russia thrust itself onto the European political system, international system. It's always been part of that European system, even though it was not exactly Western. Right now, there is a rupture, and this is very, I think this is very real. I don't think it will be eased before a very long time. So there's no going back, as it were, to let's say the 23rd of February, not to speak of 2013, before the Ukraine crisis actually began. When I look at this situation today, I do not see any chance for compromise between Russia and the West in the foreseeable future. Now, the question is, what sort of a future do you have in mind? Well, I would say to be on the safe side for the rest of this decade. At least this is my expectation. Actual hostilities may not last very long, may not last years. They may last a few more months. They may last half a year. They may last another year. But even when the hostilities stop, I see no peace settlement at the end of that period. There may be a stop of hostilities without a peace treaty, without a peace settlement that would be recognized de jure or even de facto between Russia and Ukraine, Russia and the West. Nor do I see any sanctions relief. Well, this is clearly related to what I've just said. I do not see even a major easing of the sanctions in the foreseeable future. I'm sorry, but my list is all pretty bleak. Anyway, I will continue with that because I think it's important that we do not entertain many illusions about what may await us in the future. I can't see serious dialogue between Russia and the West, the United States and the Europeans. What I do see, what I do find important, even vitally important, is communication channels, something to deconflict, something to prevent the worst from happening out of misunderstanding, out of misperception. So no compromise, but also no capitulation. If there are people in the West who still believe that Russia could be beaten into submission or beaten to recognize its defeat, I don't think this is conceivable at this point, because where Russia is today, this issue has become existential. It is not only about who wins in Ukraine, but what sort of Russia will exist. And if you imagine Russia being defeated in Ukraine, just for the sake of argument. Then I think this would call in the larger issue of the sustainability of the Russian political regime, which calls into question the sustainability of the Russian Federation itself. So, as I said, this is totally existential. Again, let me underline that I do not believe that Russia may fail to achieve what its maximum goals may be, and we're still mystified about what precise goals the leadership has in mind. My working theory is that these goals, these goalposts keep moving, and what I think Russia wanted at the beginning of Russia, meaning the people who decide for Russia, essentially meaning Mr. Putin, what the objective was on the day of the operation, a few weeks later, when the Russian and Ukrainian negotiating teams met and had a fairly productive discussion in Turkey. That may not be, in fact, that is not what the objectives are today. And maybe tomorrow they will be different from what they are today. So much for where we are. So let's go to the second point. What is Russia's agenda today? I think it's very clear that the top issue on the Russian government's agenda, on the Kremlin's agenda, is to prevail on the battlefield in Ukraine and achieve strategic success. Call it victory, call it something else. Again, we still don't know what actual form that success will take for the leadership to present it as victory to the Russian people, because any success by Russia will have been bought at a very high price. And the success, what has been achieved, should be worth it. And we can discuss the meaning of demilitarization or denazification, the two demands that Mr. Putin put forth at the beginning of the campaign. But anything that Putin will have been satisfied with needs to be confirmed, or needs to conform to the expectations of the Russian people. And it was very clear that the terms of agreement, so-called, between Russian and Ukrainian negotiating parties in Istanbul were almost immediately rejected, both in Ukraine and in Russia. And the person who negotiated for Russia in those talks has lost, in terms of personal credibility, enormously. Although clearly he was not the one who was calling the shots. The second point on the agenda is to withstand the Western pressure through sanctions and other restrictions and limitations, and avoid economic and financial collapse. As things stand today, I think this is achieved to a fairly significant degree, maybe to the surprise of a lot of people, so that the expectations of the fall in the Russian GDP this year are being revised from say 12, 10, 8% to as little as 4 or even 2.5%. We'll see what happens in the rest of the year, but it's interesting that the dynamic is what I've described. Russia has been able to withstand the blow better than most Russians expected, although most Russians including the decision makers, were surprised by the severity of the sanctions that were imposed, and particularly by such moves as the seizure, or as Mr. Putin would say, is stealing of Russian currency reserves in the West, 300 billion of them, the private property of some Russian tycoons and other wealthy people in the West, and many other things. The third point on the agenda of the Kremlin is to keep the domestic social political situation stable. And I think that basically they're looking at two things. One is inflation. Mr. Putin is famously extremely concerned about high levels of inflation. And when inflation was on the rise in the first few weeks since the start of the campaign in Ukraine, the central bank resorted to some drastic measures to curb inflation, which to a degree has worked. Unemployment is the other thing. So again, as in the previous crises, not just after the imposition of the previous sanctions in 2014, but in the global crisis of 2008, 2010, the advice from the Kremlin to Russian entrepreneurs and the order to state-owned enterprises was to keep people on the payroll. They may not have a chance to actually work and produce things, but they should not be reduced to the level of unemployed people, and that is a politically very important issue. The government has been able to do something else also. It has been able to sustain the aura of normalcy in Moscow, and I would say almost in the entire territory of Russia, except for the regions right on the Ukrainian border that are being bombarded by the Ukrainian forces. So if you walk around Moscow, as I often do, or walk around Russian countryside, the Russian countryside where I presently am, there are no signs that there's anything different this year from the previous year. So the war is not felt on a daily basis. It is important that Mr. Putin's order to the military was not to use conscripts, to use only contract soldiers and professional officers. This is a painful lesson that the Russian leadership learned both in Afghanistan and in Chechnya. When you send in young people and they return in coffins, this is extremely destabilizing for the social situation of the country, extremely depressing. Russia is sustaining losses that are substantial. And yet those are the losses of people who had essentially pledged to, if required, to give their lives executing the orders of their commanders. My next point is that the next agenda item is to win information war within Russia, assure loyalty of the elites, assure the acceptance of the Kremlin's policies by the bulk of the population. Again, this is a box that I can tick right now. There's been a surge of support from Mr. Putin. The elites, the part of the elites that decided to go back to their riches and protect their riches from whatever, or just those who felt that they would be trapped inside Russia, they did leave, including most of the liberal opposition figures and a lot of sympathizers. A number of tycoons left Moscow. We're talking about people like Pyotr Avin and Mikhail Friedman of the Alpha Group, and people of that ilk. Those who stayed in Russia essentially are following the Kremlin line for different reasons. Some of them out of necessity, many of them because they believe that in this clash between Russia and the West, they should be with Russia. A major point on the agenda was to reorient economic relations to non-Western countries and strengthen political ties with those countries. It is surprising how quickly this has been done by the private sector in the Russian economy. They showed a lot of resilience, flexibility, resourcefulness, and things have been pretty quickly reorientated eastward. Right now, the government is working on a new economic model for Russia that would have to be more autarkic for security reasons. This is part of the wider trend of securitization of economic policies. But it also aims to build an economic model that is more directed by the state. The role of the state is certainly moving up, particularly in the upper echelons of the Russian economy, big business, and just a notch or two below. At the same time, the government is trying to give more freedom to small and medium-sized companies, and we'll see what happens as a result of that. In the time remaining, let me talk a little bit about the ingredients of the decision that Mr. Putin took. Actually, the decision came as a surprise to a lot of people, including myself. I will be very open about that. I didn't think that Mr. Putin was going to launch a full-scale military operation. I thought that what he was doing was essentially aimed at squeezing the West for all possible concessions on the Ukraine issue. But having thought about it, having thought about why I failed to see, and there was, of course, no preparation for anything like what we saw in the morning of the 24th inside the country, which was very stunning. And yet, in retrospect, you can see some of the ingredients that went into Putin's decision. First of all, I think what happened was what is going on, essentially, is a preventive strike. Basically, Putin must have concluded that time was not working for Russia. Indeed, time was working for Ukraine. Somewhere from the late 2010s, Ukraine was getting stronger militarily, bolder politically, and more systematically supported by the West. The diplomatic instruments, such as the Minsk process, the Normandy group, turned out to be absolutely non-performing. France and Germany, that were the guarantors of both the process and the group, essentially displayed their utter powerlessness in Kiev. They were not listened to by the Ukrainian leadership that only orientated itself toward the United States. While the United States was getting more active and more in military terms, various military drills in Ukraine with Ukrainians in the area, the Black Sea, and all that. Some of U.S.'s NATO allies were probing Russian defenses off Crimea. You would recall that a British destroyer sailed into the territorial waters off Crimea, just provoking the Russians, which did not amuse Mr. Putin. I think that Mr. Putin and the Russian intelligence saw a considerable demonstration effect in Ukraine of the Second Karabakh War, in which the originally weaker party, Azerbaijan, with the help of a major outside player, Turkey, managed to overturn the Armenian defenses in Karabakh, something that a lot of people had thought would be unlikely before it happened. The direct dialogue with President Zelensky in Kiev, which looked promising at the end of 2019 and early in 2020, was blocked as a result of the intervention of the ultra-rightist and the virulently anti-Russian elements within the Ukrainian body politic. And maybe the last straw, maybe not, but this certainly illustrated the trend. The loose remark given by Zelensky in Munich at the security conference in February, just a few days before Putin made his decision, or at least gave an order, his loose talk about Ukraine revising its non-nuclear status. And that, I think, may have been the last straw. There's another thing. Putin is turning 70 in October this year. And 5 out of the 6 waves of NATO enlargement so far, depending on how you count them, but the vast majority of the NATO moves to enlarge toward Russia happened on Putin's watch. The Russian president must have been painfully aware of his own responsibility. And I have an impression that he decided not to leave that issue, the Ukraine problem, to his successors, so that the Ukraine thing had to be resolved while Putin was in the Kremlin on his watch. I don't think that initially there was a global agenda attached to that. I think it was more about Ukraine, more about Eastern Europe and the security situation in Ukraine. You would recall his demands, the ultimatum, some people call them, that was issued in mid-December. And that included a number of demands with regard to Ukraine: no NATO in Ukraine, no Ukraine in NATO. But it also included NATO's dismantlement of its military infrastructure in the eastern states that had been built over the previous 25 years. And I think this is still on the agenda, but I don't think that initially, this may be different today, but initially this was not something that had a global element to the agenda. Thwarting the US dominated global order, or doing something beyond Europe and Ukraine. So I think I would stop here. I have a few other things to say on the prospects of the conflict, but we can discuss them in the Q&A period. If that's fine with you, it's over to you, Julian.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. That was very interesting, and it was really valuable to hear your insights.